Second Thought is a cringy, embarrassing left-wing propaganda channel that spreads misinformation without giving it a second thought. Yes, I went there. And we're going to get into their video about America as a democracy. But before we get into that, before I disassemble this, we got to hear from Noble Gold. Gold and silver have stood the test of time. They give stability in times like these. Start an American Eagle IRA with Noble Gold this month, and along with first class service, you'll be getting a 1/10 of an ounce American Eagle gold bullion coin as a free gift. And you'll have peace of mind that you made the right choice, as well as growing thousands of extra tax-deferred dollars over the years safely and steadily. To secure your investments and get this great offer, visit noblegoldinvestments.com. Use the custom URL in the pinned comment and the description of this video. It lets them know I sent you. Or call them at 877-646-5347. Again, that's noblegoldinvestments.com. Use the custom URL. Seriously, it really helps. Or call them at 877-646-5347. So the video we're talking about today is entitled, Should America Be Considered a Democracy? And before you write it down in the comments, I am well aware of the fact, and they actually acknowledge the fact, that a lot of people are going to point out that America is a republic and not a democracy. But they mix up the terms and try to make it work. Regardless, it doesn't matter. That's not really the point of the video. The point of the video is to trash the United States of America. And you could just look at the poisoning of the well in this video to determine that for yourself.
But whether the nation lives up to the standards it supposedly represents and by which we judge the rest of the world. Let's start with a brief look at the nation as a whole. What is it? What does it represent? The US is the richest nation in human history, home to some of the very wealthiest people on the planet. It's also a nation of crushing inequality. The richest 3 people own more wealth than the bottom 160 million Americans. And Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon and the richest man on earth, makes more money in 1 minute than the average American household earns in almost 2 years.
Two things. One, I thought this video was about whether or not America was a democracy, and yet he's going off on income inequality as if income inequality is a problem in any way at all. As long as people are growing in income as a whole in this country, income inequality is not an issue. I'm not afraid, or I don't hate somebody for having more, because I'm not dumb enough to believe that I have less because they have more. And by the way, the whole Jeff Bezos makes this much in a minute or an hour is nonsensical. What Business Insider essentially did was track Jeff Bezos's net worth from 1 year to another, where his net worth nearly doubled, and then divided that up as if it was a salary. Net worth isn't a salary. Also, if you actually looked into what Jeff Bezos's actual salary was, he makes about $82,000 a year as the CEO of Amazon. Now, he gets perks and dividends and all that doesn't tell the whole tale, but treating net worth, which is tied to how you're doing as a company when you're heavily invested in that company, as income is just not true. He only gets to spend that money when he sells those shares. And the funny thing about being a guy like Jeff Bezos is that as soon as Jeff Bezos starts unloading those shares because he wants some spending money, people will assume that there's a problem with Amazon, and the values of those shares will actually go down. It's one of the weird things about having your net worth tied into a stock market when you're the face of the company, even if you're not the CEO anymore.
And yet, with all this wealth and superb geopolitical positioning, the US still fails in several key metrics. Some 40 million of its people live in poverty, with another 10 million right on the brink.
So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier about how you don't have less because somebody has more. Remember, he was going with the whole income inequality, the rich getting richer and all that, but the poverty statistics that he cited that are linked in the description of the video actually showed a decline in poverty of about 4.2 million people between 2018 and 2019. If people getting richer made poorer people poorer and income inequality got worse in that time period, how could 4.2 million people be lifted out of poverty? Also, I completely object to the assertion of American poverty. I hate to break it to you, but the poverty line in the United States of America means you're not poor. If you're living at it, sure, it's a struggle to be in this country. Sure, your cost of living might be high, but we have to acknowledge the reality that what we're measuring in the United States is relative poverty. This is why the United States can rank below other Western European nations in their number of people in poverty, but those people in poverty can have higher incomes than the middle class of those European nations. A common international metric of poverty when comparing nations is to say that people below 60% of the median income in the country are people in poverty. This gets really absurd when you start comparing actually poor nations to places like the United States of America. Our median income is about $30,000. 60% of our median income is about $18,000. So below $18,000 would be considered poverty by this international metric. However, if your median income was $1, then you are in poverty. But if that's the median income, then only the people below 60 cents a day would be considered in poverty. And if the United States has more people below 18,000 than this fictional country had below 60 cents, then we would have more poverty than them. And that's absurd because virtually everybody is poor in a nation where the median income is $1 a day. But okay, sure, the United States of America, whose poor have electricity, TVs, cell phones, are morbidly obese, we have a poverty problem, and the middle-class Europeans that live in smaller homes and don't have the amenities and higher cost of living versus the United States poor, they're not in poverty at all. Like, they're doing way better. We need to be more like them. Sure, whatever.
American healthcare is consistently rated the worst in the developed world, with thousands dying or going bankrupt every year thanks to the extraordinarily expensive system.
So I will give credit to Second Thought, whoever's behind this, for at least citing the sources in the description of the video, so I don't have to dig them out. The source of this claim comes from the Commonwealth Fund, which compared 11 nations in healthcare, supposedly, and came to the conclusion that the United States is the worst. However, if you were trying to compare these nations objectively and you weren't trying to produce the outcome of making the United States the worst, you would use none of the metrics that were used by the Commonwealth Fund. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go to some of those metrics. So the Commonwealth Fund opens up by talking about how the United States puts about 17.9% of the nation's GDP into their healthcare system, which is more than any other country on the list that they showed us. And while healthcare spending is growing faster than GDP in the United States of America, that is not on its own a sign of something negative. Remember, when wealthy nations get wealthier, spending on luxury items goes up. For instance, healthcare is not the only thing that Americans spend more money on or a greater proportion of their money on over that same time period. And in fact, a number of items' rate of being spent on actually grew faster not only than the rate of GDP, but the rate of healthcare spending, which was about 290% compared to GDP's 171%. Spending on pets climbed 353% over those same years. Live entertainment went up more than 500%, 639% on phones, and 900% more on computers. The point I'm trying to make here is that this metric on its own is not useful for anything, because if we applied the same logic of healthcare growing faster than GDP being a problem to pets, we would say that not only we have a healthcare crisis, but we have a pet crisis, we have a telephone crisis, we have a live entertainment crisis, and we have a computing crisis in this country. That doesn't make sense on its own, but maybe the other metrics are actually good. Maybe the scoring system will be more fair to the United States of America, and let me just tell you, it's not. So another one of the dimensions of comparison that allowed the Commonwealth Fund to say that the United States has a worse healthcare system than all of the counterparts presented in this survey was infant mortality rate, which sounds like on its face would be an objective metric. However, what if these nations actually count their infant mortality rates completely differently? And that's not a hypothetical question. That's actually what happens. In the United States of America, if you have a baby born and that baby dies, it goes into the infant mortality rate, which is what you would think of when you think of the phrase infant mortality rate. However, the European counterparts that are in this comparison do not measure infant mortality the same way the United States does. It's not even close. In France, they only include the baby being born and dying if it's after 22 weeks of gestation. In Poland, a baby has to weigh more than 1 pound 2 ounces to count as a live birth. It is common practice in several countries, including Belgium, France, and Spain, to register as a live birth only those infants who survived for a specified period beyond birth. The United States also has significantly more preterm births than these other countries, and this is because Americans are less likely to abort a baby upon detections of problems earlier in the pregnancy. And according to the CDC, much of our high infant mortality rate is attributed solely to the fact that we have more preterm births. And on top of that, the CDC says that if the United States of America counted births, live births, the same exact way as Sweden, our infant mortality rate would cut in half. The Commonwealth Fund also uses life expectancy as a metric for the healthcare system, which is really strange because they don't bother to normalize the United States in terms of our automobile fatalities and due to our murder rate. Our murder rate is 4 times the murder rate in the United Kingdom, which is ranked number 1 according to the Commonwealth Fund's metrics. We also have significantly more deaths by auto accidents than almost every other country in this survey except for one. And we have more obesity, and you can't really attribute that as a problem to our healthcare system because the healthcare system has to deal with the consequences of obesity. But even if you were to ignore the obesity thing and set it on the healthcare system, you're wrong about that, but let's just let you do that. If you just normalize the mortality rate for automobile accidents and death by homicide, the United States would be number 1, or at least at the very top of life expectancy in the world. And the fact that the Commonwealth Fund did not do that is an absolute embarrassment, and there's no excuse for it unless they were trying to produce an outcome that would be put in a propaganda video just like this. And what's most amazing about the Commonwealth Fund's comparisons is that they seem determined to compare every other factor except for what happens when you get sick in these countries, which I would think would be one of the best ways to evaluate a healthcare system. Maybe the reason why they don't want to do that is if you were to compare the 5-year cancer survival rate of Americans to Europeans, you wouldn't get favorable results. For instance, if you get prostate cancer in the United States of America, your 5-year survival rate is 99.1%. In Denmark, the socialist paradise, it's 47.7%. For kidney cancer patients, the survival rate in the US is 68.4%, doing a little worse. It's just 45.6% in the UK, which is ranked number 1 by the Commonwealth Fund's ranking system. They also make a big deal about access, which again, if you're assessing quality of healthcare, then why are you ranking access? Maybe if you're assessing quality of the healthcare system, you would rank access as one of the factors. But what they ignore is the delays for elective procedures for people in these nations, and they all have insurance or they're all covered by some kind of system, sure, but they wait way longer than an American would wait having insurance in our system. So it would seem like the problem in the American system is that we need to get more people insured or we need to get more people in the system, not necessarily the quality of our healthcare or the wait times in our healthcare system. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't problems with the American healthcare system, and although spending as a percentage of GDP on its own is not a good metric of the problems in the American healthcare system, costs are a huge problem. What I'm saying is that the data used is deliberately designed to produce the outcome that the American healthcare system is the worst, when in reality, if you normalize the data like any normal statistician would, you would not get those results.
In 2018, America was added to the list of most dangerous nations in which to be a journalist.
Again, we have another incredibly deceptive piece of propaganda that is completely disproven by the citation under the video. If you go to the Time magazine article, what you'll find out is that they did a quantitative analysis, not a qualitative analysis, of the safety of journalists in the United States of America. What do I mean by that? Well, the United States ranks about 6th in this year in terms of deadliest for journalists, but that's due to the fact that 6 people died that were journalists in the United States of America, or were killed during their course of their work as journalists, kind of. And here's what I mean by that. 4 of them were killed in a mass shooting. Now, a mass shooting is awful, but the person behind the mass shooting was not a state actor. It was somebody angry about the coverage that he personally received by the newspaper. 2 of the people that were killed in North Carolina during a storm when a falling tree killed them. Now, call me crazy, but if you look at the nations ahead of the United States of America, there's one missing, even though we're covering 2018, because in 2018, the Saudi Arabian government murdered Jamal Khashoggi. However, since the United States technically had more journalists die during the practice of journalism, even though that murder by state actors, Saudi Arabia, according to this metric, actually ranks as a better place to be a journalist than the United States of America. Long-term viewers of this channel will remember I did an entire video on how to lie with statistics Honestly, this is a textbook case of doing so.
And that was before the targeting of journalists by police in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. These should all be red flags on their own.
Again, another cleverly worded piece of propaganda in order to lead you to believe a conclusion that is not valid. So, we're talking about the Black Lives Matter riots. Remember, the police were breaking up riots. Now, were there some instances over the course of these riots which were record-breaking in their damage and unparalleled in their level of violence? Sure. But a lot of this is journalists saying that they felt like they were targeted because they were nearby when they got shot with tear gas, etc., etc. There's some serious injuries in there, and I'm certain there's some bad behavior by the police. But this, coupled with the previous statement, is leading you to believe that America is much more dangerous for journalists than it actually is. Just remember how the media treated President Trump during his time in office and how there were no negative repercussions for the media for doing so. They were rewarded with ratings and status every time they went after the guy. They went after the head of the federal government, and there were no consequences. In fact, press freedom got better under Trump because Obama was using the Espionage Act against the media pre-Trump, and Trump wasn't doing so as frequently.
But if we're talking specifically about democracy, we need to look at more testable areas of civic life. For the rest of this video, I'll be drawing some data from a report titled Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens, which was published in 2014 in the journal Perspectives on Politics.
So he goes into this study about how America is not actually a democracy. America is an oligarchy that I've been wanting to talk about forever on this channel, but I'm going to skip through a bunch of the noise and nonsense and go to the ultimate conclusion that he comes to, and then tell you, again, with this very study itself, why he is incorrect.
These graphs from the study sum up the findings pretty well. Regardless of average voter desire for legislation on any given issue, the odds of representatives delivering the desired result is the same. Contrary to this, we see a strong correlation between economic elite and special interest desires and legislative action. This should be alarming, because if our votes are meaningless, then we don't actually have any say in how the country is run.
So what this study does is it attracts opinion polls over a period of time. Now, we've discussed opinion polls multiple different times on this channel, and we've discussed how Americans tend to show preferences for contradicting things. I've done healthcare a million times on this channel where I talk about how people say they're in favor of a Medicare for all system because they like the name Medicare for all, but when you go into the details, they think they're able to keep their private insurance. They're in favor of it as long as their taxes don't go up, as well as a bunch of other contradicting things that would lead you to believe that when polled on the specifics of the policy, they're not actually in favor of it. Another great example of this is for conservatives. Most Americans say that it's important to balance the budget, but whenever you ask them to cut anything, they're against it unless it's something like foreign aid, which only represents an insignificant portion of the budget. It's like less than 1%, and it wouldn't balance anything. The reason I bring this up is because this is actually noted in the very data that is being cited, that the rich might be getting what they want in terms of policy because correlation with policy knowledge actually goes up in this country with income levels. So what this actually shows us is that the uninformed masses don't get what they want in a majority of issues, according to opinion polls, because they have no idea what they're talking about and they want contradicting things or contradicting policies. But the people who actually know what they want and are informed about what can actually be done, the costs and benefits, get what they want more often. This makes perfect sense, and there's nothing wrong with it. Hate to break it to you, but maybe if the general public didn't want stupid contradicting things according to the opinion polls, they would get their policy preferences more often. Also, this is outdated data. I believe the survey only goes up to the mid-2000s. So we don't know how it is affected post that moment, but I'm sure there will be a follow-up study that will come to the same conclusion because it's not like Americans are more informed on what they want in opinion poll questions.
That would mean our system is not democratic. Okay, but if our votes are meaningless, why do politicians try so hard to convince people to vote for them? Well, think of the optics. Without a significant number of votes from the population, the country would not be considered democratic at all. The illusion of the shining city on a hill would be shattered, and the decidedly undemocratic oligarchy laid bare for the rest of the world to see. So those votes from average citizens are crucial.
So after making a baseless assertion based on cherry-picked data that this person didn't bother to go through as thoroughly as I did, he then talks about how American politicians ask for votes out of some conspiratorial way to make it seem like they have the consent of the governed. No, the reason that they campaign for your votes, and they don't campaign based on policy or logic. They campaign based on emotion because that's what people vote on, whether or not they like you, whether they think you're a good guy or a tough guy or whatever, regardless of whether or not their preferences align with yours, is because they need your votes to win. Sometimes the simplest answer is the correct answer.
But by actively seeking votes and encouraging voting, politicians open themselves up to the undesirable possibility of being voted out. If only there were some way to ensure that vote totals from states would always deliver the desired outcome. Enter gerrymandering. As a quick crash course on state-level politics, each state is divided up into voting districts of similar population sizes to facilitate the process of voting and establish a number of seats to be filled by representatives. Makes sense. But what doesn't make a whole lot of sense, from a democratic standpoint, is how these districts are drawn.
So he then goes in on gerrymandering, and a lot of people are ready to jump on board because they're against gerrymandering, and he makes the case that politicians shouldn't be able to pick their districts because they're essentially picking their voters. And while that might sound smart and intelligent on the surface, in reality, somebody's going to have to pick these districts. And there are actually consequences that progressives, more than any other group on planet Earth, would not be in favor of if you were just drawing perfectly square or circular, same-shaped districts across the country. And I'll get into that later, but first I want to hear the non-truth about how this person would totally be in favor of abolishing all partisan gerrymandering.
And before you go calling me a partisan hack, I'm opposed to gerrymandering from both parties, and you should be too. Both Democrats and Republicans do it, and while it's technically not illegal, it should be. It gives politicians tremendous control over the outcome of elections, and that should not be acceptable in a healthy democracy.
Again, I'm willing to bet that he is not opposed to gerrymandering from both parties, because most of the gerrymandering Supreme Court cases were won by people trying to increase minority representation in Congress. Now, some that use race as the determining factor to draw districts were struck down. In fact, all of them were struck down. But then they use voting data because certain demographics of people tend to vote nearly identically. And the courts ended up holding that up as constitutional because the process of gerrymandering a political district is inherently political, so it's okay to use political data. Now, why are people, particularly people on the progressive left, ultimately going to come down in favor of gerrymandering? Take this district from New York City, this weirdly drawn district. Now, on its own, this looks ridiculous. Why would they draw this district in this way? And you might say you're in favor of getting rid of this district. However, if you were to get rid of this district and draw this in a certain way to make it more reasonable geometrically, what you would end up with, likely and historically, is less Jewish representation in Congress. You see, these are historically Jewish neighborhoods in New York City, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe that Chuck Schumer, the current Senate Majority Leader, actually won his first congressional race running in this district. If you were to draw this in a certain different way, you would actually reduce the level of minority representation in Congress. Now, the reason I use this district in particular is because I live in New York City, so I'm familiar with the weird districts because I've looked at the map in my city. But if you look across the country, almost any time you see a weirdly drawn district like this, more times than not, this is done to increase the number of Black representatives, the number of Hispanic representatives. Whatever minority group is in the population that isn't dispersed evenly is the beneficiary of this district. Now, if you ask progressives if they're in favor of a policy that would actually eliminate minority members of Congress, they would say no. But doing gerrymandering in a neutral way would do just that.
Look at this hypothetical state. It's 60% blue voters, 40% red, and it needs to be carved up into 5 districts. Now, proportionally, you would want 3 blue and 2 red districts. But if you draw the lines like this, you can get 3 red majorities and 2 blues. And if you draw it like this, you could get 5 blue majorities and no red.
If we were to take the very same hypothetical congressional districts that John Oliver was talking about in the segment that's used in this clip, and we were to swap out Democrats for white people and Republicans with Black people, we could end up in a scenario where, despite representing about 40% of the population, Black people have no congressional representation. They're not a majority in any single district. Now, if this isn't a problem for you because you're on the right and you're not racist, I totally understand that position. But remember, I'm arguing with somebody who's on the progressive left, who's taking progressive left positions on how bad the United States of America is. Do you think, honestly, they would legitimately sign up for a deal where 40% of Black residents get no congressional representation by race? They value race above almost every other characteristic in this country. So he's not in favor of it. I'm willing to put my money on it.
But perhaps even more egregious than gerrymandering is outright voter suppression. There is no right more fundamental to democracy than the right to vote. It's always been in the interest of some politicians to dissuade certain voting blocs from casting their ballot, or to make it more difficult for them to do so. But in recent years, voter suppression has reached levels that would cast doubt on the legitimacy of our elections if they were to take place in any other country. Repressive voter ID laws, voter roll purges, gerrymandering is also a form of voter suppression.
So voter IDs are not voter suppression. Voter suppression is a myth that Democrats put out into the public to delegitimize elections when they lose and to boost turnout. There's a lot of talk about how black people can't get IDs, which is incredibly racist, yet every time a voter ID law is passed, black turnout appears to go up. On top of that, I think all, if not but one, of the states that have voter ID laws offer a free version of that ID to people if they just go to the place. And one of the ways that you know voter suppression is totally nonsensical is just look at the example that he gives us in this very video.
But at least those responsible for questionable district maps can hide behind the technical legality of their actions. What we're seeing out on the voting trail is much more alarming. Instead of going to all the effort of trying to convince people not to vote, those in power have taken to simply closing polling locations so voters don't even have the opportunity. This has been a widespread problem in recent years, and it's finally starting to get the attention it deserves. Take the Kentucky primary on June 23rd. In a normal election year, Kentucky would have over 3,700 polling stations available. This time around, they slashed that number to under 200. Nearly half of Kentucky's black voters live in a single county. Jefferson County had just one polling station.
So one of the things that you should notice about that, number one, is that he showed voting lines in Georgia, which have long early voting, etc., and that was from June 9th. So he's showing B-roll that has no connection to what you actually see, except for the fact that you see people wearing masks in those videos. Now, he talks about the reduction of polling locations, but remember, they're wearing masks because this was a year where coronavirus was a thing. Most of these people, in fact, record numbers of people, got absentee or mail-out ballots during their election. And in fact, due to these measures, a record number of people, not only in the county that he's referring to, but in Kentucky overall, voted in the 2020 primaries. So the example of voter suppression that he's giving is incredibly misleading. By the way, one of the reasons why they were closing polling stations is because poll workers, scared of COVID, refused to show up. So they had to have one for in-person voting, minimum per county, but they mailed out ballots to all of these people and they made it incredibly easy for them to access those ballots. And that's why a record number of people voted in these very primaries that were supposedly suppressed. Again, this is just a propaganda tactic from the left to boost turnout. They're trying to say people are trying to stop you from voting, so you think, oh, I'm not going to let that happen, so I'm going to go out and vote extra hard, even though there's no evidence for it at all whatsoever.
What those in power are doing is making it impossible for the people to make their voices heard. They are denying Americans their most fundamental democratic right. At what point do we have to admit that our elections are illegitimate and undemocratic? We're not shy about stepping in when other countries conduct fraudulent elections, so why should we get a free pass?
Also, never mentioned in this piece, likely because the maker of this video just wants you to assume that the governor of Kentucky is a Republican, the governor of Kentucky is actually a Democrat. So the idea that the Democratic governor would cut off at the knees a largely Democratic constituency, absolutely absurd.
The thing we need to realize is that this is not some unfortunate and unforeseeable outcome. This is the system functioning as intended, at least as intended since the 1980s. Crippling precarity for the many to build the ever-growing affluence of the few. Ask yourself whose voice matters in American politics. Whose desires are taken into consideration?
So ultimately, this video wraps with a whole bunch of conspiratorial talk and questions like the one that I just played for you. This is by design. Who's benefiting from this? Whose ideas are being pushed forward? Etc., etc. It's nonsensical. It's funny that you're not allowed to question the legitimacy of elections, and this video does it, and not only does it get away with it, but it's rewarded for it, even though it's complete propaganda. But I really wanted to go through one of these videos just to show you how, even through their own citations, what they claim is being refuted. It's really important to understand propaganda and talking points disguised as data. When somebody presents you with questionable information, you need to ask to see the sources. And then after you look at their statistics, you need to ask about the methodology. What are the metrics that had them arrive to those statistics? And you need to be able to spot propaganda right away. Remember, this was all about American government, supposedly, and whether or not we're democratic enough, but the bulk of the focus was based on smearing America for things that are not related to the democracy. Also, don't really care about democracy. Freedom is way more important than democracy. I'm 100% in agreement with Lauren Chen on that, and you should be too. The reason we have a republic is to protect the minority from the whims of an angry and vicious majority. So if people aren't getting what they want democratically 100% of the time, that's good. That's the system working. It should only be when there's broad consensus that major changes in this nation are made, and not broad consensus on stupid opinion polls that when you ask follow-up questions completely break down. Legitimate broad consensus. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you liked the video, then show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social medias. They are linked in the description. Support for the sponsor also in the description, and it's in the pinned comment. This has been me talking about second thoughts propaganda. Till next time.